So discrimination could be direct discrimination. So an example of that would be an employer deliberately setting out to not employ women, for example. Or it could be indirect. An example of that, we see it quite a lot because we also recruit staff for our customers, is not wanting to take older people on. Now, you're not setting out to say, I don't want to recruit older people, but the reality is some employers will only recruit people who are younger, and they're not even aware they're doing it. So that's an example of indirect discrimination. But it's not just about direct and indirect, there's more we need to know. Discrimination could be by association. So an example would be if an employee has a disabled child, the employee themselves doesn't have the protected characteristic of disability, but the child does. And so by association, the employee would be protected under the Equality Act. Not just association, discrimination could also happen by perception. And a typical example of that is if in a workplace someone is being taunted by their colleagues because they think they're gay, for example, but it transpires they're not gay. The fact they're not gay doesn't matter. What does matter is that they've been subjected to a detriment, to detrimental treatment because of a perceived protected characteristic, and that would still avail them of the protection afforded by the Equality Act. So I want to talk to you a little bit about discrimination in the workplace. It's a very important topic, not least because it's one of the most expensive tribunal cases to defend, and the claims tend to be much higher than other categories of employment law breaches. But what actually is discrimination? Well, discrimination, as you can see from my chart, means effectively less favourable treatment, and that could be on the grounds of a protected characteristic, what we call, of a person. So less favourable treatment could be during a recruitment process. They don't have to just be an employee, or it could be during employment generally. But what actually is a protected characteristic? There are actually 9 protected characteristics listed under the Equality Act, some of which I'm sure you'll recognise and some you may not. So just running through them on my list, age is a protected characteristic. If we discriminate against somebody on the grounds of their age because they're too old, because they're too young, then potentially that could be a breach of employment law. Sex, male or female, only recruiting men or not recruiting females of childbearing age and so forth. Disability, religion, and not just religion, but belief as well. If somebody has a deep-seated particular belief that's shared by lots of people and actually has a well-grounded basis, then that could well be a protected characteristic. Sexual orientation, whether somebody is gay or straight. Pregnancy and maternity speaks for itself, I think. Transgender, for people who are undergoing a sex change, whether pre-op or post-op, doesn't really matter. Marital status, whether somebody's married or civil partners. And the last one, and possibly the biggest one of all of the categories, is race discrimination. So having looked at what discrimination actually is, what do we do about it? How do we make sure it doesn't become an issue in our company? Well, the first thing we say to people is you need to have the correct policies in place. You need an equal opportunities policy, and you need something that we call a dignity at work policy. And these will highlight what discrimination is, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and so on. What we also need to do then is to make sure that people have seen those policies, and it's a good idea to make them sign a piece of paper or something that says, yes, I've seen that policy, I understood it, and I agree to abide by it. And some organisations, particularly if they're a little bit larger, might also need to undertake some training so that staff are actually trained in discrimination, what it means, how to recognise it, what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And if those things are done, then an employer will have, in most cases, a due diligence defence to protect itself if, for example, one employee discriminates against another one.